Okay, we will make a start so that we don't end up going too far over time. Good morning, everybody. So we've discussed the question of this moment from a German perspective, from a setting of the scene, from the questions of nationalism we addressed in the last panel. So this particular panel takes a very different approach, or perhaps it'll become less different over the time of the papers, by looking at the concept of the Baltic littoral as a cordon sanitaire against communism, how that idea was understood by Western actors and how it influenced and shaped the region. And the phrase cordon sanitaire was actually used at the time as a kind of medical metaphor for the new geopolitics, in which these new states that were being established or attempted to be established by force would act as a bulwark against communism from the East. And we are delighted to have three speakers now who can address this topic powerfully and importantly. The one thing I say, I know there are some concerns with volume. We have tried to turn up the microphones. Is it sounding better? It is. Brilliant. Okay. I'd like to begin with Andrew Lambert. Andrew Lambert is the Lawton Professor of Naval History at the Department of War Studies at KCL. His work focuses on the naval and strategic history of the British Empire between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War. His work has also addressed issues of technology, policymaking, regional security, deterrence, and importantly, crisis management and conflict. So, I turn things over to you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and great privilege to be here with you today, and I have, like the rest of you, already learned a great deal, so I will proceed. What I want to look at today is the way in which Britain made policy in the Baltic in 1919. This is not a coherent process, it's not straightforward, and one of the underlying issues is that Britain was never technically at war with the Bolshevik government of Russia. And you might think this would limit your options, but as we will see, the British did not limit their options. They found ways of achieving what they wanted as far as possible within limits by the end of the war. So how does Britain view the Baltic? Well, this isn't a 1919 question. This is a 1704 question. When the Russians arrive on the Baltic littoral, they become a problem. It's a very large country over which Britain can exercise relatively limited influence. And as the Russians come to dominate more of the Baltic, they dominate more of the things that the British are in the Baltic to do, which is trade, and particularly trade in things which are vital to Britain's economic and strategic power. In the 18th century, Baltic naval stores are so important for Britain that the Royal Navy is in the Baltic pretty much every year whenever there's a conflict. Without those naval stores, there is no navy, and there is no merchant navy, and there is no trade. So the British are not a Baltic power, but the Baltic is critical. And that's a two-stage process. Can you get into the Baltic? Can you go through the Danish Straits? And secondly, how do you sustain yourself within the Baltic while you're operating there? So it's again about building partnerships. You need some kind of regional location where you can operate. So the right of access to the Baltic, the ability to operate in the Baltic, and control of what is happening there is critical for the British through a very long period of time. The only thing that's changed by 1919 is that the Baltic is not a critical supplier of naval stores. It is still economically highly attractive, and the British are going into the Baltic looking for many things, but among them trade is significant. Of course, in 1919, Britain is the global naval and imperial hegemon. It is on the winning side of the First World War, and it has a very large roster of issues to resolve, the most important of which is protecting the right to use economic warfare against American attempts to liberalize the global ocean and prevent the use of economic warfare impacting neutrals in future. This is what the great fight for the British in 1919 is about. It's at Versailles, and it's with the Americans. The peace with Germany is less of a problem than the peace with the Americans. And this is a long-term issue. It also has some ramifications for the Baltic, where, of course, the British will be imposing a blockade on Germany and, to an extent, Russia throughout 1919. The idea of a military action, a Cordon Sanitaire, proposed by Ferdinand Foch, the generalissimo at the end of the First World War, was very attractive to those who saw Bolshevism as an ideological threat. Winston Churchill picks it up, but pragmatic men like Prime Minister David Lloyd George understood the need for peace, retrenchment and reform at home, the avoidance of large-scale future wars, and the exploitation of opportunities to improve the situation rather than to try and radically reconstruct it. So Britain's view of what is happening in the Baltic is invariably contingent. They are going to make commitments which are not binding. They recognize de facto the independence of the Baltic states, but they don't recognize them de jure, because that would be a commitment. The British are supporting the White Russian generals, but they really don't want the White Russian generals to win, because a united, coherent Russia, pre-1914 size, would be a constant threat. The British recognize that Russia as a grand empire is a standing menace, and therefore a smaller Russia is a more attractive option. The great advantage they have in 1919 is that they have a navy which is still mobilized on a very large scale and is full of highly experienced professional operators. This is not a navy that will struggle to apply force or to extend the rules of engagement beyond what the politicians have specified, but within the area that the politicians are prepared to allow them to operate. So after all of those years of British experience, how does this begin? In the 19th century, the British had used the Crimean War to begin the process of moving Russia backwards in the Baltic. The neutralization of the Åland Islands was a critical stage in that. And it transformed the strategic balance to the extent that after 1860, Russia is essentially a defensive power in the Baltic, vis-à-vis the Baltic as a sea area. The Russians are defending themselves, and they are building fleets and naval strategic positions ashore to defend themselves against what they see as an imminent British offensive. And the British use the Baltic as an avenue to leverage Russian actions elsewhere globally. A Russian advance towards Istanbul sees the British mobilize a fleet to go into the Baltic. A Russian incursion into Afghanistan sees the mobilization of a British fleet to go into the Baltic. These British fleets don't get any further than Portsmouth, but the fact they've been mobilized does have a bearing on the strategy adopted by Russia. So the British have a long history of leveraging Russian behavior through the Baltic, but they understand that it has limits. The opportunities of 1919 are attractive because Russia is unstable and the future is uncertain. The idea that Finland and Poland could become independent had long been an attractive option for the British. They were looking at this in the Crimean War. This was their next stage if that war had turned out in the way that they had imagined. The opportunity arises because the other major powers effectively leave the Baltic to the British. At Versailles, everybody's very busy with their own agendas, so the Baltic becomes somewhere that the British can deal with among the great war-waging powers. The Foreign Secretary at this stage, Arthur Balfour, is a veteran of the British governments of the late 19th century, which had faced a series of crises with the Russians over the Far East, over Central Asia, and over the Ottoman Empire. And he recognized that the British had always used sea power as their means of exerting pressure. So the British have a contingent policy. It's evasive and it's imprecise. The instructions given to the admirals who go into the Baltic are open to interpretation because they are hoping that the man on the spot will solve their problems by acting decisively when they have not actually requested them to do so. Let's remember, of course, that the Baltic is not an easy area in which to operate naval forces. It is relatively shallow. It has large numbers of dangerous marine hazards. The waters of the Baltic are less saline than those of the wider ocean, so ships float deeper than they would out in the open sea. It's even difficult to get into the Baltic, and of course half of it freezes up in the winter, normally around the turn of the year. So the British know all of this. They have an excellent collection of Baltic charts, But even in 1919, they're updating, refreshing, and making new charts of the Baltic to enable them to operate more effectively. If you don't have the charts, you can't operate. If you have the charts, you can operate much more effectively. The British have excellent charts, and they develop these across the year. Whenever the Royal Navy is operational in areas it is not familiar with or is not usually in, it will update its cartographic information. The Hydrographic Bureau is a very good indicator of British strategic activity. As we heard much earlier in Holger's lecture, the Russians had lost a lot of territory, they'd lost a lot of resource, including industrial resource, shipbuilding resource, and the revolution had badly damaged the Russian Navy. The Navy that was still under the control of the Bolshevik government was relatively inefficient. As Trotsky finally confessed, it was run by Soviets, it was not run by regular naval discipline, and many of the ships were unserviceable, had been damaged during the war and were not repaired. So the loss of infrastructure was a significant restraint on Russian activity at sea. The Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, Admiral Sir David Beatty, raised the issue of access to the Baltic on the 21st of October 1918. That's Trafalgar Day if you're in the Navy. Just in case people forgot that the Baltic is a critical element of Britain's strategic power. It had been Britain's plan to get into the Baltic in the First World War, but that had not happened. But now in November 1918, the armistice terms include the internment of the modern German battle fleet. And it's not accidental that the light cruiser commander who escorted the Germans across the North Sea was immediately sent back across the North Sea into the Baltic in command of the British squadron. Foreign Secretary Balfour thought that the Navy supporting the independence of the states in the Baltic would be the outermost limits of British action. And he took a more global imperial view of what Britain could do than many of his contemporaries, including the Prime Minister. This compromise, where the British are backing the white Russian forces but hope they don't really win, suggests that the British haven't made a clear decision about what they want to happen at the end of the Russian Civil War, because they know they cannot influence this. And if they get too close to this, they will get dragged into a large commitment, which is the very last thing they want. So the Foreign Office issues instructions for Rear Admiral Alexander Sinclair's force. I quote, "The primary object of your visit to the Baltic is to show the British flag and to support British policy as circumstances may dictate. A subsidiary object will probably be to supply at your discretion the Estonian or other national governments on the Baltic coast with arms and ammunition. The British government have definitely decided against any military commitment in Estonia, and any assistance you may think fit to give should be limited." So you can read this in whichever way you like. You could decide that you really shouldn't do anything, or that you could do quite a lot of things. The government said that any Bolshevik warships that were attacking any of the Baltic states could be judged as hostile. The Admiralty transmitted that as saying that any Russian warship on the coast of any of the Baltic states, whatever it was doing, should be treated as hostile. So there's some maneuver room being inserted here. The Admiralty knows what the man on the spot would like to do, and it's giving him a lot of cover. The Admiralty will support their man on the spot throughout this very effectively and very positively. So Britain doesn't expect it can change Baltic geography, but if the Baltic geography is changing, Britain is happy to support that movement. So it's about what you can do and what you can not do. At the same time, of course, Britain's primary naval effort is not in the Baltic or in the White Sea or in the Eastern Pacific. It is in Versailles, and it is engaged with the Americans. So the top brass of the Royal Navy are not fighting this campaign, they're fighting the Americans at Versailles, and they're going to win that battle. It's a much more important battle for Britain's global power than this. This is one theatre, that is a battle that determines everything. 1919, of course, is very unusual. The two dominant Baltic powers, Russia and Germany, have been damaged greatly and weakened by the outcome of the war. This makes Britain's ability to operate in the region much greater than it would have been in any other circumstances. Even in the late 19th century, when Britain and Russia were facing off, Germany had to be put into the equation. It was a major territorial power with first-class armed forces. That is not the case in 1919. So we have to see this as a unique moment in time, not a normative set of actions. Britain cannot do this normally. It can do this in 1919. Commerce is important because Britain does need to rebuild its trade links, and Britain is a major consumer of Baltic produce, forestry products, foodstuffs. Much of that is flowing out of the Baltic into Britain in 1913, and the British need to reconnect. This is why some of their policy decisions look a little odd. They are reconnecting. Finland is included in the Export Credit Guarantee Scheme in 1919 before it's been legally recognized as an independent state. The trade is more important than the niceties of politics. So restoring a balance of power in the Baltic is the most important tasks. And if the ports of the Baltic states and Finland are not under Russian control, that will be a major boost. They will still be major ports for exporting Russian produce, but they will not be under Russian control, and they will not be Russian strategic bases. It also means, of course, that the Russians will be pushed back further into the Gulf of Finland. If you look at the Russian coast, when all of this is over, it is a very short coast indeed, much like it is today. Only, of course, it was even shorter after 1919 because there's that section of Finland which is now under Russian control. Here is HMS Cassandra, the rather ill-fortuned and ill-named light cruiser flagship of late 1918 at Copenhagen in November, very shortly after the mission to escort the High Seas Fleet across the North Sea.
I must also wrap up in the next 5-10 minutes.
Yep, absolutely. So the Cassandra went all the way to the coast of Estonia to support the Estonian army and then ran into a mine and sank. That didn't stop the rest of the squadron supporting the Estonian army in their resistance to the Bolsheviks around the Narva River. And it was British naval gunfire support that brought down the key bridge that blocked Bolshevik offensive. So Edwin Sinclair followed his orders. He extended his orders. At the same time, Halford Mackinder is writing a geopolitical study of all of this, but we will have to talk about that perhaps another time. The ongoing blockade of Germany and the Soviet Union is complicating affairs. The British need to do this for a number of reasons. So Edwin Sinclair's force is removed. When the ice forms, they then reform and come back under Walter Cowan, who will command in the second campaign. Cowan's force is actually smaller than Edwin Sinclair's initially, and his rules of engagement are even more restrictive. That doesn't stop him becoming highly aggressive when he arrives. The first people to feel his ire are, of course, the Germans in Riga, where Andrew Cunningham, who will be quite significant in the next major war, has a serious standoff in the harbour. He's the officer who protected the government after they'd been deposed. Cowan is well aware that he needs to get forward. He needs to base his force first in Tallinn, and then eventually, with the support of the Finns, he moves into Bioko Sound, which is the base the British had planned to use for the attack on Kronstadt in 1856. He develops a highly offensive posture which secures the initiative at sea and secures also reinforcements, which enable him on the night of the 18th of August to conduct a torpedo boat and air raid on Kronstadt, which sinks one Russian battleship and damages other ships. This secures the initiative in the Gulf of Finland for the British. This means that if the White Russian army is going to advance on Petrograd, which it does, it will not meet any opposition at sea. As I said, the British are not entirely sure they want the White Russians to win, but this is certainly a useful initiative. The success of that operation leads the British government to reinforce Cowan with more offensive assets. And the end of the campaign, it sees the arrival of a ship called HMS Erebus, which is a coast attack monitor armed with very large cannon. And this conducts an attack on fortresses on the southern shore of the Gulf of Finland, opposite Kronstadt, particularly at Krasnaya Gorka, in support of a short-ranged Estonian offensive. What the British are doing is sending a very powerful signal. They have the ability to do a great deal of damage to Russia's position. And these offensives coincide with the growth of the Bolshevik peace initiative. It's quite clear the British are well aware of what the Bolsheviks are doing, and they see this as the best solution. The British have demonstrated their power, the Bolsheviks are prepared to compromise, and the British now encourage the Baltic states to settle with the Bolsheviks on the terms they've offered. So national independence is something that the British are very pleased by, and so they support that. The last action of the Baltic campaign is, of course, getting the Germans out of Riga. And the same ship, HMS Erebus, is used to bombard the German army with some very large ammunition. And at the end of all of this, the British have secured their longer-term aims. Russia has been pushed off the Baltic coast. It is not in a position now to dominate those regions. Finland and Baltic states are independent. Poland is independent. This is very much a Victorian wish list. And it's been the exploitation of opportunity, unique contingent opportunity, that enables this. So there's the coast of Finland. There is Bioko Sound, from which the attack staged. There is Kronstadt, just above the E of Petersburg. The British cement their victory by sending HMS Hood, the biggest warship in the world, on a Baltic cruise in 1920. Brand new, 50,000 tons, enormously important symbol of power. They back it up in 1921 and most other years by sending elements of the home fleet into the Baltic, round all of the friendly capitals and back out again. So the British have no permanent Baltic presence, but they're constantly in the Baltic. They're trading, the navies are there, they're making those port visits, they're supporting their agenda right the way through the interwar period. And this, I think, is the critical outcome. Britain is able to dominate the Baltic Sea, and it uses that to leverage the situation that they want to have going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We're going to move swiftly on at rapid pace to our next speaker, and I'm delighted to welcome Kęstutis Kilinskas here to speak on the supply of weapons to the Lithuanian army and the clash of interests there. Kęstutis is assistant professor at the University of Vilnius Faculty of History, and his research focuses on war and society, as well as a military focus and diplomacy as well. And I am now going to find your PowerPoint. Hang on. You're going to help. Here we are, perfect. From beginning, over to you. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for opportunity to be here. I am glad that I have an option and opportunity to share my knowledge with you. I choose to speak about a very narrow topic, but I think it very well represents and reflects the interest of all the players which was involved in the battles for the Baltic states of independence in the 1990s. After the collapse of the Russian Empire and after the end of the World War I, Lithuania fought in its wars for independence and received military assistance with weapons, ammunition, clothes, and foods from the Allies and Germany. In my presentation, I will analyze the questions via the lens of the foreign policy interests of England, France, Germany, and I will try to show the dynamics of the weapon supply in changing environment of war. In the first part of my presentation, I will speak about the Lithuanian dependency on the Germany, then about the unsuccessful attempts of Lithuania to get the weapons from the Allies, specifically and primarily England, and then I will finish with the question of the weapon supply from the Allies and England, and I will try to speak about the changes of the Western policy towards the Lithuania primarily. So I'm going to the first part of my presentation. On 16th of February 1918, Lithuania announced its independence, but the real capabilities to build the state, establish government, and the military forces appealed only in the November of 1918. At the same time, the Red Army started its assault to all Baltic states and January occupied Vilnius and the northeastern part of the state territory. Here on the map, you could see the primary situation in Lithuania and Latvia at the beginning of the 19th. In the face of the Bolshevik attack, creation and armament of Lithuanian military forces became problematic. There were only approximately 3,000 volunteers who had no appropriated weapons, and the German military forces who had to stay in the Baltic states didn't comply with the armistice terms and started to withdraw. In that situation, Lithuanian political leaders attempted to find ways how to get arms from military forces in order to stabilize the situation on France. These attempts were based on the foreign policy directions. One direction towards the Western countries, primarily England, and another one to Germany. In the first part of the 1990s, German influence became dominant in Lithuania. Germany granted the loan of 100 million marks to Lithuania, and it became the most important financial support for the state, but at the same time, it hesitated to provide armament for its military forces despite Lithuanian appeals. Commander of the Eastern Front, who was already mentioned today several times, General Max Hoffmann, and representative of the German government to Lithuania, Ludwig Zimmerle, expressed the opinion that arms can only be given with the permission from Berlin. Germany began to change its position only when the Red Army began to threaten Germany with the revolution or the uprising of the Spartaks. In January and February of 1919, Germany stopped its evacuation of military forces from the Baltic states, and Saxon voluntary units, or the part of the Freikorps, arrived to Lithuania, and Germany as well at that time became the most important supplier of weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. Here we have to emphasize that the Germans agreed to provide weapons to Lithuania when it was necessary for the protection of her interest, and it also means that the interest of Lithuania was not sufficient for that decision. The weaponry provided by the German army on the February and March was completely sufficient to arm 5,000 soldiers and to stabilize the front line where you see what you see on the map. After the stopping the Bolsheviks, the German army began to centralize the arms supply process, and it became more complicated, and later on they supplied only non-lethal military equipment, munitions, and clothing. Actually, that is the interesting thing. When it was the German interest treated by the Bolsheviks, they supplied directly the weapons, but when those threats disappeared, they moved to the more commercial line, I would say like this. But the more important was that the German government also decided not to support the Lithuanian army to attack Vilnius. We can associate the negative position of Germany with the complicated relations which rose on March when the French military mission arrived to Lithuania. And actually then the competition between the German and the interest of allies started to play. In the reaction, or the German reaction to the French arrival to the Lithuania was expressed very well by the German officers, who told that it will no longer to be able to help the Lithuanian army to organize itself. Situation became worse in May and June when the condition of peace was presented in Paris, and it was a huge alarm in Germany, and all parties decided to reject it. On the 28th of June of 1919, the German units withdrew from the Lithuania and left behind a very small and insignificant amount of ammunition, and most of which were not suitable for the use for the military forces. Despite the withdrawal of the army, German companies, on the commercial way, they provided the opportunities to buy the weapons from the Germany, but the German government, they didn't support that idea. As far as can be determined from the archival supported, from the archives, Lithuania repeatedly applied to Germany to purchase weapons, but in December of 1999, Germany was already restricted by the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. Therefore, it refused to sell weapons without the consent of the Entente at all. So it was a serious warning and proof that the competition between Entente and Germany military factors began to affect the supply of weapons to Lithuania. Then I will go to the second part, and I will speak about the appeals and obstacles to get the weapons and ammunition from Entente. As we already mentioned it at the beginning of my talk, in the second direction of the foreign policy of Lithuania was directed towards allies. In the December of the 1990, a squadron of the English fleet arrived to the Baltic Sea and supplied the Estonian and the Latvian armies with weapons and ammunition. The prime ministers of Lithuania, Valdemaras and Sleževičius, considered the orientation towards England unconditional and priority. Therefore, they sent missions to meet the English squadron. They sent missions to meet the English fleet and requested weapons and ammunition from one of the captains of the squadron. But the latter replied that he could not give any weapons without the knowledge of London and advised to apply to the government of England on those matters. We also have to keep in mind that the British politics between the December of 1918 and 1918 was dominated by the idea to stop the spread of the Bolshevism to the West. But the execution of that policy was concentrated primarily on the Estonia and Latvia. Despite the fact that the contacts with England were very difficult, on the 6th of April of the 1990, Herbert Grant Watson, the first representative of England diplomacy, visited Lithuania and promised loans, weapons, and ammunition and clothes for the soldiers. As I already mentioned it, on May, relations with Germany became complicated, and the Prime Minister instructed the Lithuanian delegation in Paris Peace Conference to press England and America to give us ammunition, weapons, and clothes as soon as possible. But nothing was achieved. The most important was that Britain kept very reserved position regarding the Lithuania, and since 16th of April decided to support the White Russian generals, specifically Nikolai Yudenich army and its march to Petersburg. At the beginning of May of 1919, Mykolas Sleževičius, who was the Prime Minister of Lithuania, he assessed that Lithuania was not strong enough to fight against the Bolshevism and the Poles alone. Therefore, it was forced to maintain the modus vivendi with Germany due to its military support. According to the Sleževičius, when we received weapons and money from allies, then we will be able to demand Germany to withdraw its troops from Lithuania. On May, Lithuanian delegation at Paris Peace Conference appealed to Economic Commission for financial laws and military support, pointing out that without an urgent loan, Lithuania would not be able to withstand the military pressure of the Bolsheviks. The Entente, or the Allies, was warned that the situation would become even more difficult when Germany would have signed the Treaty of Versailles and have to withdraw from Lithuania. Only then the United States Liquidation Commission agreed to sell weapons and clothes to Lithuania only through a private company, because according to Commission, the decision of the US Congress should be needed for providing of the weapons. As we could see, dependence to Germany, which has no alternatives, became the obstacle for the supply of weapons from United States. On June, Lithuanian military mission in Paris began an intense search for weapons and military supplies. They made meetings with the Commander-in-Chief of the French General Lerond, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army Edward Spears, United States General Bliss, Italian Hugo Cavallero, and the Japanese General Takeshi Nara. But no results were achieved, and situation regarding the weapons remained unclear, and the Lithuanian delegation at the Paris Peace Conference considered the situation to be critical. Germany did not agree to give weapons to Lithuania without the permission of the Allies, while the Allies stated that it would not give weapons to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Germans, while they are still in Lithuania. Efforts of Lithuania stuck in never-ending change of never-ending close cycle. Then, change in British and French policy happened only at the end of 1919 and was determined by the fact that German military forces, instead of evacuation from Baltics, reapproached with the soldiers of the Western Russian army and had intentions to remain in Baltics and attacked Riga. Only then it was realized that the obvious dependence of Lithuania on German supply of weapons was a dangerous trend. In October and November of 1919, during the Lithuanian army fighting against the German Freikorps in northern Lithuania, situation became critical because Germany stopped all supply of weapons to Lithuania and units faced the trouble of ammunition. Only approximately 3,000 rifles were received at that time from England. After the second assault on Riga, the position of the Allies became more firm and favorable for the Lithuania and Latvia. On the 10th of November, Allies created Commission of the German evacuation from the Baltics and became determined to help the Baltic states and Lithuania with weapons and war material. Due to that, Lithuania received weapons from the German army warehouses in Metz, thanks to the French military mission to Lithuania. France provided for the Lithuanians several hundred machine guns, more than 8,000 rifles, 3 million cartridges, and so on and so on. It was the biggest supply from the Allies in the year. More to that, during the evacuation from the Baltic states, Germany was obligated to hand over arms and ammunition to Lithuania. And with the pressure from the Allies, Germany provided 20,000 rifles. Actually, after the collapse of the German Freikorps in the Latvia and Lithuania as well, the weapons managed by the Germans were transferred to the armies of the Baltic states. That was the decision of the Allies. When the arms were handed over from Germany, England promised to supply arms to Lithuania. At the conference of the military commanders of the Baltic states, armies in Valka, on 6th of January 1920, General Turner stated that the meeting was important for giving the weapons to the armies of the Baltic states, which means that England retained an interest in the supplying of arms. In a favorable situation, Lithuania decided to use momentum to get more weapons and ammunition from England for 30,000 soldiers. But as well as we know from from the resources from Lithuania, none of them reached Lithuania. But more to that, the head of the British military mission in Lithuania, Colonel Rowan Robinson, proposed to the Lithuanian president to reduce the army to the 15,000 personnel, and pointed out that it would be difficult to get the necessary items for such big army as it was appealed. Answer to this question lies in the British foreign policy. At the beginning of the 1920s, the interest of the Allies in the Baltic were achieved. German threat was gone and rapprochement with Russia began. So there was no interest to support Baltic states with weapons in order to protect the interest of the Allies. And then I would like to go to a conclusion that analysis of weapons and ammunition and military hardware supplied to Lithuania during the War of Independence indicates that depends on overlapping foreign policy interest of the both appealing and providing country. During the War of Independence, Germany supplied weapons when it needed to stop the Bolsheviks and to counterweight influence of Poland in Lithuania, and refused to do that when Lithuania intended to promote her own foreign policy interest to capture Vilnius. The same happened with the Allies, who refused to supply weapons to Lithuania despite its appeals in the first half of the 1990s. And Lithuania received weapons from the Allies when it faced direct threat of the remaining units of the German army, which also became dangerous for the vital interest of France and England in Baltics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kęstutis. One of the interesting things about this panel is that we're seeing the construction or the thought of building states both on their own and to resist Russia from a number of different angles, from the perspective of a great power, from the perspective of a new nation. And now something different, which is from the perspective of people, and people emerging from a country with a long-standing commitment to neutrality. I'm delighted to welcome for our final paper Dr. Rikard Westerberg, who is a friend of the Centre as part of the Axon Johnson Institute for Statecraft and Diplomacy. He's also the Centre Director at the Centre for Statecraft and Strategic Communication at the Stockholm School of Economics, where he teaches on economic history and the history of applied history and economic statecraft, essentially. So I'd like to welcome you to the stage now. Can you see your presentation here? It's a PD. This one. Thank you. That one. Here we go. It overlaps with that. John. How do I do that? Fantastic. Okay.
First of all, let me extend my warmest thanks to Brendan, Donatas, and everyone else on the organizing committee for bringing us to Cambridge and this beautiful venue. On Friday, I am bringing my daughter to the Harry Potter world just outside of London, and I've realized we're already here. Perhaps it is apt to conclude that never in the history of academic conferences has so much been owed by so many to so few. I also realize that I am now the only person standing between you and lunch, so I'll try not to go over time. And let me turn to the topic at hand, Swedish volunteers in the Estonian fight for independence in 1919. Many of these volunteers ended up in the so-called Swedish Corps, and you see their armband here on the first slide with the Swedish colors above the Estonian colors, of course. I think this topic is important for three reasons. The first is that volunteers did play an important role in all the Baltic countries when they gained their independence, although, as I will conclude today, the Swedish contingency, which was to a large extent a failure. Their fate is also less known to us, especially compared to other voluntary efforts by Swedish volunteers in the 20th century. And third, perhaps they can teach us something about why young people in this age, especially young men, decide to go abroad to fight for other countries. And this, of course, brings us to our own time and the effort in Ukraine. So far, 3 Swedish volunteers have been confirmed killed, and we don't know how many that are fighting on the Ukrainian side. An exact number is difficult to establish, at least for the time being. But when you hear, as you have done today, about Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, about volunteers, about secret weapon supplies, of course, it's hard not to think about our own time. Even though Sweden has been neutral or non-aligned from 1814 until now, that is if Erdogan in all his wisdom will let us into NATO, Swedes have participated in various conflicts against Russia in the last century. The most well-known of these, I would say, is the voluntary effort during the Winter War when Soviet Russia attacked Finland in 1939. Then around 10,000 Swedish citizens fought on the Finnish side. A Swedish volunteer corps consisting of around 500 soldiers had also fought in Finland in 1918 on the so-called white side in what I know now is not the civil war, but the internal war. Thank you, Thomas. Several of these men went on to fight on the other side of the Finnish Bay in the Estonian War of Independence, where some of them ended up in the Swedish Corps, known in Estonian as the Ruotsi Corpus Estimal, in the chaotic year of 1919, when the young republic gained its independence, first from Russian political authority, then from German military authority, and finally from the threat of a Bolshevik revolution backed by Lenin's new federative republic. In my own research, I have been particularly interested in who these men were and why they wanted to fight a war for another country. The Swedish military historian Lars Eriksson lists 4 general reasons for participating as a volunteer. First, the will to make a contribution for something one believes in, including your political convictions. And second, to enhance one's professional knowledge, especially if you're in the military. Third, the longing for adventure. And this group also includes those who have a hard time acclimatizing to normal life upon return and therefore keeps returning to conflict areas. Fourth, money. And fifth, the sometimes closely related issues of love, criminality, and economic hardships. To this, I think we can add yet another reason, especially among young men, and that is the possibility to come home as a hero. And that was what had happened to a lot of the Swedish soldiers who had been in Finland in 1918. And you see here on the pictures how they were greeted when they came back to Stockholm. In 1915, Germany tried to convince Sweden to join the war against Russia. The reward was to be influence in Finland and in the Baltic countries. And although this request was denied by the government in Stockholm, the Germans were well aware that Sweden did have an interest in the eastern Baltic Sea. 3 years later, in the fall of 1918, Jan Tönnesson, a representative of the coming Estonian Republic, met with the Swedish foreign minister and the minister of the Navy. Tönnesson asked for 2 regular army regiments to help with domestic security while the younger country built up its own defense force, stressing the obvious threat from the Bolsheviks in Petrograd. The Swedish forces would keep the peace until an Estonian legislative assembly had been elected. Similar suggestions were also made by the United Kingdom and the United States, and actually even by the provisional Russian government. But the request was denied. Sweden had no intention of getting drawn into a conflict with Russia, and similar decisions were also made by the other Scandinavian governments. The British grew impatient with this, and for other reasons, as we have heard, decided to send in the Royal Navy into the Baltic Sea in November 1918, just when the Bolsheviks had captured Narva in northern Estonia. also, as we just heard, in addition to providing the Estonians with materiel and shelling Russian positions, the British Navy also transported volunteer troops from Finland to Estonia. In January, one of these units, led by the former Swedish NCO Martin Ekström, recaptured Narva, and this received substantial attention in the Swedish media. In conservative and military circle, of course, Narva was a place of almost mythical proportions, that it was here that Charles XII had defeated a much larger army in 1700. In total, around 3,000 Finnish volunteers fought in Estonia, while around 300 Swedes and 200 Danes made it over. Although the government refrained from playing an active role in the conflict, it did allow for volunteers. Around Christmas 1918, an Estonian delegation had negotiated with Swedish officers on the establishment of a volunteer corps. And in early 1919, the recruiting campaign got started, something which left-wing newspapers very much opposed. The campaign was led by Dr. Gustav Hallström, a well-known archaeologist with conservative leanings and German sympathies. This was not a strange choice, as Hallström had also organized the Swedish brigade to fight on the white side in the Finnish internal war. And as we have heard, when they had returned to Stockholm, they had been welcomed as heroes. The initial idea was to send volunteers to both Estonia and Latvia, the two Baltic countries with the strongest historical ties to Sweden. There were, for example, over 10,000 Swedish-speaking Estonians at the time. The ties to the Catholic Lithuania were less strong, and the country had never been a part of Sweden. Although Swedes did fight in all the Baltic countries, it was only to Estonia that soldiers were sent in an organized manner. Any attempts of sending volunteers to Latvia were called off after Dr. Hallström was part of actually creating a diplomatic crisis between the young republic and Sweden. In February 1919, he was arrested in Liepaja, together with a Swedish lieutenant colonel and officer of the general staff, Nils Edlund, and a leading Baltic German nobleman, Henrik von Stryk. In von Stryk's personal belongings, the Latvian customs officers found a well-worked-out plan for a coup, unknown by the Latvian government, but supported by Baltic German nobles, to create a Baltic dukedom consisting of Latvia and Estonia. Von Stryk was then accused of high treason, but managed to flee to Germany with German forces. Edlund managed to flee from custody, and Hallström was later released. Dr. Hallström had ambitious plans for the volunteer corps, aiming at 4,000 men. My own research shows that about 1,500 signed up, out of which a third were officers or non-commissioned officers. Around 20% of these were veterans from the fighting in Finland. This should, of course, not be a surprise. For the officers, a tour abroad was the way to get combat experience and move up the professional ladder. Of the 1,500, only 7 were deemed as inappropriate or subject to investigation, according to Hallström's notes. So passing as a suitable recruit seems to have been no real difficulty. It also seems as if Hallström, as had been the case with the Swedish brigade in Finland, was good at recruiting from all social classes, ranging from officers from the nobility to privates in the countryside. Earlier research has claimed that the interest to sign up for the Baltic Volunteer Corps was low, but my own research showed that there were more signing up for this effort, about 1,700 persons, including the non-military, than for the mission in Finland. However, whereas the brigade in Finland constituted of 800 to 900 persons, only around 300 actually went to Estonia, and out of these, only around 100 ended up in the organized Swedish corps, while the rest spread out on Estonian units and Finnish and Baltic German units. My interpretation is that there was a big initial interest, but that this cooled off quite fast, given the negative press that the corps received. This was especially true in the left-wing newspapers that you can see on the slides. Out to the left, there's a call for a protest meeting against a murderous campaign in Estonia, and in the middle is a satire of what the Swedish officers and soldiers were actually up to, mostly drinking and behaving badly. By looking at the letters sent to the recruiters in Stockholm, we get a sense of who these men were. They were young men who had been in Finland and now wanted to keep on fighting the Reds, who wanted to get away from the mundane life back home and to make money. The pay was 300 Swedish kronor per month for married men and 225 for unmarried. A typical worker salary at the time was around 280 kronor. Thus, for young men without any higher education or permanent unemployment, there were economic incentives to sign up, especially as those who had been in Finland were blacklisted by the unions and for that reason had difficulties in finding jobs at home. In January 1919, the first volunteers made it over. And by studying the lists of who these men were, we can also conclude that they gave themselves higher ranks in Estonia than they had had in Sweden. Ensigns became lieutenants or captains or even lieutenant colonels. Overall, the corps lacked senior command, something which would prove problematic. The Swedes were sent to defend Narva, where 4 of them were killed in action. 2 former NCOs, Karl Mothander, who had been fired from his regiment in Sweden in 1915, and Karl Georg Malmberg, who had served as a mercenary in Belgian Congo, led the volunteer corps. Mothander set up his headquarters, somewhat suspiciously perhaps, at room number 6 at Hotel du Nord in Tallinn. Corruption plagued the corps, and money paid out by the Estonian government for salaries and uniforms disappeared. The men in Narva soon got a reputation for outrageous drinking and bad conduct. While morale plummeted, the corps captured and killed a Swedish officer who belonged to a unit led by the Baltic German Baron Stackelberg. The officer, Giuseppe Franchi, who was the son of an Italian immigrant, had come to Narva on behalf of his commander to try to recruit Swedes, as he had the impression, probably correctly so, that the unit was falling apart. The corps' leadership meant that this was an attempted mutiny and put Franchi before a court-martial that had no support in Estonian and Swedish law and found him guilty and had him shot. They were never tried for this, but the incident created a huge amount of bad press in Sweden, something which you see here in the middle from one of the left-wing newspapers, and the unit was then directly placed under the war minister in Tallinn and the officers in charge replaced. The unit was then transferred to southern Estonia, where they participated in fighting around Podlice and Mitkovica. In the coming weeks, men kept leaving the corps, and in early May, only 68 remained, while several were treated in field hospitals. When Major Lambert, the corps' new commander, proposed to the Estonian government to recruit a new volunteer unit, the Estonian commander-in-chief, General Johan Laidoner, stated somewhat laconically that, "I think one try is enough." In early June, the corps was dismissed, having lost a total of 5 men, and estimates indicate that a total of 19 Swedes were killed in the war. Several of them stayed on in Estonia, however, joining Finnish, Danish, Estonian, and White Russian units, fighting on the other side of the Narva River on the Eastern Front until the peace treaty was signed in Tartu in February 1920. So who were these men then that fought in the Estonian War of Independence? Well, they were really no different from volunteers in other conflict zones, seeking adventure and getting away from the everyday mundane life, making a contribution, gaining professional experience, making money, escaping hardships, and coming home with a new identity, maybe even being greeted as heroes in the same way as the volunteers of the Finnish Civil War. Many had indeed fought on the white side in Finland and had difficulties in getting back to civilian life, especially as the unions did not want these men back in the factories, and the left-wing newspapers labeled them as murderers. For the volunteers and others, the Bolshevik threat was a strong motive to continue fighting the Reds in the countries with strong historical and cultural ties to Sweden. These ties, however, were less strong to the Baltic states than they had been to Finland. Without competent officers and a strong backing from the Swedish establishment, the corps quickly fell into non-disciplined behavior. And with the scandals surrounding the corps itself, its recruiters, and the chaotic situation in the Baltics in 1919, only about 4 that registered actually went. Military historian Lars Eriksson concludes that, in comparison with the much larger Finnish volunteer corps, the Swedes never managed to establish a strong and powerful unit, instead of splitting up on various other units under different command. In comparison to the volunteer corps sent to Finland in 1918 and then later in 1940, this was by far the least successful. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you so much. And we have time for questions, which is fantastic. So I open to the floor. And Donatas was eager to jump in, so go.
Thank you. Very fascinating panel. Cordon Sanitaire is a very curious concept because it implies isolating a certain territory and letting the disease play its course. So my question to you is whether from your analysis of weapons supply to the Baltic states or from analysis of the British naval policy in the Baltic states, where do you think the boundary of this Cordon Sanitaire lie? Is it along the eastern border of the 3 Baltic states, or is it along the western border of the Baltic states? Because probably the West might have been equally content with, the Baltic states getting swarmed with Bolshevism, as long as it doesn't spread further than that to Germany and to Poland. Thank you.
Yep, trigger first. Yep.
Okay, so if we speak about the 1990 So I think that there was no clear understanding about that. It was left more or less for the military actions. And here we have to also emphasize that we have there, I would say, the United Kingdom as a much more bigger player, for example, in the Latvia and Estonia, and probably Lithuania, and the France and Poland. So I think it was partly on the interaction between those, I would say, powers. And I think that the Kherson line, which partly lies, was the more or less the line which was agreed by the Western powers. And then if we speak about the Lithuania specifically, and if we speak about the 1920s, so I would say it was the conclusion of the Bolshevik and Poles War.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's an excellent question. The British are looking at this quite seriously. Both the Admiralty and the Foreign Office have perspectives on this. Essentially, they see that if Finland remains independent, that will be a major asset for the British. It will deprive Russia of most of its Baltic frontage. And if the 1919 boundary holds, it will mean that the Russian fleet is pinned back in the eastern end of the Gulf of Finland and is effectively irrelevant to global politics, even if it can sortie out into the central Baltic. They think that Finland is likely to remain independent. They are hopeful about Poland and the Baltic states, but they are not convinced that that is a durable settlement. And I think if we look at what happens in 1939-40, we can see the geopolitics of that unfolding. The British can see what will happen if the Bolsheviks and Germany form an alliance, which they do in 1939. They will be able to snuff out as much of independent Baltic states' freedom as they wish, and there is nothing the British can do about it. So by 1939, the strategic balance in the Baltic has been heavily influenced by the dramatic improvement in aircraft capability, which means that regional terrestrial powers are much more likely to be able to block naval intervention. So the British are not optimistic that all of the gains of 1919 will hold. The fact that they do is in many ways a benefit. So I think British policy is contingent. There's a line somewhere between the eastern and western extremes that they would be comfortable with. They end up with pretty much the extreme eastern version of that. And that's, I think, that's a great benefit to them. And it exposes how relatively weak the Bolsheviks were in 1919. Remember that they're transmitting their peace process, their peace proposals in clear on the radio, and they're also briefing the Manchester Guardian on this. Lenin has a friend in Moscow who is the correspondent of the Manchester Guardian. So the British government knows exactly what the Bolsheviks are doing, and that's why they're encouraging the Baltic states to get on board with this process. The Bolsheviks are trading space and resources for time because this is the crisis of the Denikin assault from the south. It's not Yudenich and potentially the Estonians they're worried about, it's Denikin. And when the tide turns with Denikin, it also turns with Yudenich, and everything starts to move forward. But the Bolsheviks don't go back and unravel those plans. They stick with those plans. So the Western extreme is the worst option, but the Eastern extreme is a very attractive, and it's contingent.
I just want to add one thing, if I may. We spoke about the Bolsheviks and the Baltic states, but we cannot exclude the Whites and the recognition of the government of the Whites on May. And there was no actually talk about any kind of the statehood, only about the autonomy of the nations for the Baltic provinces. Actually, the definition of the Baltic provinces, I think it's much more related with the Latvia and Estonia. And the Lithuania should be excluded out from that, if we speak on the discourse of the British things. And for example, if we speak about the actions in the Lithuania at the early 1990s, so we have to speak not about the Royal Navy or the squadron of the Sinclair Alexander, but we have to speak about the Polish military mission in Warsaw. Sorry, British military mission in Warsaw. And the documents of them, it's much more fruitful about the events of Lithuania. We are some kind of the clash of the interest of the France and the England happening.
Okay, couple more questions. Brennan.
Thank you. Three really interesting presentations. My question is actually for Andrew Lambert. You spoke about the way in which Royal Navy commanders will be given pretty wide latitude historically, and that makes a lot of sense for the 18th and 19th century when you've got communications issues of referring back to London. Does the advent of wireless change the story? I mean, are the commanders in the period you were describing a bit more constrained, or actually does that make not very much difference?
Thank you for that, Brendan. It's a really important question. Exactly, in the 18th century, naval officers were sent off with global instructions to interpret on the day. The career of Lord Nelson is a classic example of this. He's given very permissive instructions, which he pushes to the limit, both with extreme violence at the Battle of the Nile and with extreme caution at the Battle of Copenhagen, which suggests that he's much more than merely extending his orders. But that tradition survives, and critically, in British government in this period, the Admiralty is perhaps the most important Department of State of them all. Having an independent Admiralty board, which is represented at cabinet level, means that there is a filter between the Foreign Office instruction and what the officer on the spot is getting, and the Admiralty is putting in those permissive words. I mentioned that discussion about how to treat Bolshevik warships. The Foreign Office said if they're firing, you can engage them. The Admiralty just said if they're there, you can engage them. And it's nice. It's just an elegant little extension, and they know that the man on the spot, who they've handpicked for this job, there are many officers in the Royal Navy who could have had this slot, but the two who are sent are both very, very aggressive, and they have very positive views of what they're doing. Cowan in particular, everybody knows that Walter Cowan is going to push it to the extreme, and many of the officers who go under him are also very positive-minded. Andrew Cunningham, who ends up as the hero of the Second World War, he also has German language skills, which helps when you're negotiating with the Baltic German armies, but so does having large guns.
A geopolitical lesson for us all. I'm going to ask Kęstutis to come in briefly, and then I have a question for Rikard. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add that if I get correctly, your question was about the connections or the communications between the British mission and the Royal Navy. So the communication was wireless since the late 1990, and here in London, in the Foreign Office archive, there is all the networks are shown on the map, so you could clearly find it out. And actually, they established the network when the General Go arrived in Helsinki, and they established the units in the Tallinn, in the Riga, and in Kaunas. And then they established the wireless communication between them and between the Royal Navy as well.
Okay, I have a question for Rikard, and others might want to come in as well. I was really struck by this idea of volunteers going to fight abroad, coming back and being blacklisted by unions. That as a historical moment, I think that's striking, because one of the things I'm grappling with this panel is the extent to which these foreign policy actions are actions of foreign policy or extensions of domestic nervousness and opportunity about the rise of communism in general. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about how the trade unions and the social democratic movement in Sweden viewed these interventions, and then perhaps others could come in on that domestic to foreign angle.
Sure, thanks, Hugo. I'm sure there are other people here in the audience who also can chip in on this. For the Swedish government this time, this is really an act of balance, because it's a liberal social democratic coalition government, and the Social Democrats haven't really made up their mind on how to view what's going on in Russia yet. So this is really difficult. And whereas the government takes kind of a more pragmatic approach, large part of the labor movement are extremely skeptical, both of what's happening in Finland in 1918, but less so because Sweden has these very strong historical ties to Finland, but then even more so in Estonia. So this is, and I mean, concerning also Donato's questions, from the perspective of the Swedish government, the main point is not to get caught up in a great power conflict, regardless of there are Bolsheviks on the other side of the Baltic or not. But yeah, no. So for a lot of these persons who had been in Finland and then in Estonia, this being blacklisted remained for decades. So yeah, it's difficult.
Others come in.
I just want to add that if we speak about the German nobility in Latvia, so if I am familiar well with the question. So some of them, they were evacuated during the when the military actions began in the 1990s to Sweden.
Yeah, there's certainly domestic opposition. Dockers are refusing to load military stores for the Baltics at this point. The labour movement is opposed to the intervention campaign. And there are also signs of unrest which border on mutiny in Royal Navy vessels, both in northern Russia and in the Baltic. So the end of the war means that there are a large number of people who want to stop fighting. There are some who are ideologically persuaded of the alternative cause. And I think this combination of exhaustion and the novelty of the message means that there is significant opposition. And that is a restraining factor on what the British government is prepared to do. It does not want to get committed to a war effort and find that it does not have national support. This is where Lloyd George is incredibly astute. He is monitoring what people are thinking, and he's making sure that he doesn't put the government in a position where it's going to be embarrassed. He's going to fall on his own sword on that, because in 1922 he provokes the Çanak crisis with Turkey, and that does lead to the breakup of his government, and he will be the last Liberal Prime Minister of Britain. So he gets it right this time. He doesn't get it right in 1922. He asks too much of Britain and of the Commonwealth and Empire.
Other questions? Hugo, yes. No, go ahead.
So, thank you very much. I have 4 questions, but I will keep them very short. The first question to Andrew, I got from your map that the Royal Navy was busy in the Baltic, but they did not have a station there. So basically they operated from Britain and they did not settle somewhere, right? Okay. Then the second question, the weapons delivery from Germany to Lithuania. You mentioned that weapons came from Metz, but Metz was handed over to the French in late 1918. So where exactly, when were, and the third question to you, how many volunteers came from Sweden? So what is the question of numbers? And then I have a general question, and then I'm done. The Baltic territories, at least in German, have a very confusing terminology. So you have Estonia, Kurland, Lithuania, and so on. So, and that probably most Germans don't know exactly where is what. And does that matter? Is that in other views, for example, in the British view and so on, exactly the same? And does it matter in this particular situation that maybe the borders between the various Baltic people is unclear, at least to the broader audience?
I suspect some in this audience, including Donatas, would point to the Vilnius conflicts there, but I'm going to go through questions as we go, so starting with Rikard.
Right. So to clarify them, there were about 300 Swedish volunteers that went, and around 100 of those ended up in this so-called Swedish Corps.
So regarding the weapons provided from Metz, so the French military mission provided the German guns from Metz. So I have to clarify, that's a very good question. And actually, if we speak about the weapon supply, so basically all the weapons, or the big, 90% of them, they were the German guns, because it was easier to supply, and the Germany already started to supply since the very beginning of the 1990s. And if we speak about the infrastructure of the weapon supply, so that the biggest part, what I mentioned it on the February and March, it was from the Oberkommando Nord in Lodzen. It's today's Giżycko, if I think that place called, yes. And then regarding the second question was regarding the definition of the Baltics. So I think that in German terminology it's Balticum, more or less. But the problem, I think, it remains.
Andrew, perhaps come in on the general question as well.
Okay.
So to what extent was Britain aware of borders within the Baltic states, and to what extent did fluidity in those borders shape policy?
The British are much more aware of port cities. They look at the Baltic as a trading region. They look at these great ports, which are in the Baltic states, as essential elements of the Russian economic system. And that's why they're convinced that ultimately the Russians will recover those territories, because those arguments that we heard earlier about how the Russians view this vast multi-ethnic empire as a nation These are views, obviously, that persist into the 21st century, do complicate things. But for the British, they've always viewed this as trading, and the strategic comes with. The point about the British not having a base in the Baltic is that they're demonstrating an inordinately large capability to sustain large forces in an area where they don't have base capacity. They're doing this consistently across 250 years. So building up not just naval force, but also naval logistics and support capability, building up local networks of supply, these are really important parts of how they operate. Ships don't fuel themselves. These are oil-fueled ships. Where's the oil coming from? Who's supplying this oil? Who's got the contract? Even I don't know that, but somebody is contracted to supply the fuel to these ships. That's all being organized in London through the global shipping network, but the oil is being delivered in Baltic ports.
Okay, I am keeping everyone from lunch if I take this much further, so I'm going to call a halt. One of the things that strikes me, just your conversation about weapons, this is very much a conflict that follows a global conflict. I mean, we've been having conversations in the news this last few weeks about weapons manufacture and supply. There's a hell of a lot of weapons wandering around Europe, I think, and you can't understand this moment without thinking of it as a post-World War moment. That came out in all three of your talks in different ways. I've learned a huge amount about this moment from the panel, so all that is left to say is, first of all, to thank our three outstanding panelists.